The wind carried dust across the small settlement, sweeping between the rough-hewn cabins and over the trampled ground where wagons had once cut deep tracks. It was not an easy place to live, this frontier land. Every day demanded toil, strength, and resilience. Those who faltered, even for a moment, risked being left behind. And in this world, where survival hinged on physical endurance, a woman like her paralyzed, widowed, and without the protection of kin was seen as a burden. Her name was Anna. Once, she had been like the other women of the settlement, with strong hands for weaving, cooking, and tending to children. Once, she had stood tall beside her husband as they braved the uncertainties of the West together. But those days were gone. When her husband was killed in a skirmish at the edge of their territory, her world shattered. His loss was heavy enough, but the cruelest blow had come earlier when an accident left her legs useless. Since that day, she had been dependent on the kindness of others, a kindness that grew thinner with every passing season dot in a community where every hand was needed to plant, hunt, or guard against raids. Anna's condition marked her as less. She could no longer work the fields. She could not help gather firewood or defend the stock when wolves prowled in the night. Even simple tasks, such as hauling water, had become impossible. For many, her existence symbolized fragility and uncomfortable reminder of what might happen if fate turned against them. At first, neighbors had helped. A sack of grain left at her door, a few logs of firewood stacked against her cabin, or the occasional pot of stew brought by a friend. But pity has limits, and soon the whispers began, "She cannot fend for herself. Why should we feed another mouth when she gives nothing in return?" By the second winter, she was surviving more on scraps than charity. Her in-laws, distant and cold even when her husband lived, had no interest in keeping her. She was a reminder of their son's death, and to them she was already half buried in the grave. Other widows in the settlement remarried quickly, finding new husbands who valued their labor and childbearing potential. Anna, though still young, was different. No man sought her hand. No man wanted the burden of a wife who could not walk beside him, who could not bear the endless labors of frontier life, and so she became invisible. When she wheeled herself out into the sunlight, dragging her body with stubborn effort, people looked away. Children, not yet taught the cruelty of adults, sometimes stared, whispering questions their mothers shushed. But more often than not, she sat in her cabin alone, listening to the life of the settlement continue without her, the crack of axes, the laughter of neighbors, the barking of dogs chasing livestock. Loneliness weighed on her more heavily than her useless legs. There were nights she wished she had died with her husband, nights when the silence pressed so hard against her chest she could hardly breathe. But still she lived on. Each day was a battle to endure, not because she had reason to hope, but because some small ember within her refused to let the darkness win. The settlement saw only her frailty. They never noticed how she repaired her cabin with her own hands, even if progress was slow. They did not see how she learned to make do with little, stretching every scrap of food into something that would last. They did not realize that while others grumbled under hardship, she endured hers silently with a dignity they had long forgotten. To them, she was already gone, a ghost lingering on borrowed time. To herself, though she doubted it often, she was still alive, broken, yes, but breathing, enduring, waiting for something more. The irony of her situation was cruel. In a place where strength was prized above all, the woman who bore the heaviest burden was dismissed as weak. She had faced more loss than most, her husband, her mobility, her place in society, and yet she remained. Her will was her weapon. Though no one cared to see it. It was into this life of rejection and quiet suffering that the Comanche warrior would one day step. For now, Anna did not know his name or his face. She did not know that her strength, invisible to her neighbors, would soon be recognized by one whose people lived and breathed by resilience. All she knew was the ache of being unwanted, the sting of whispers in the dark, and the constant reminder that in the eyes of her community, her worth had been erased. But fate has a way of bending stories. And sometimes it takes an outsider, a stranger feared and mistrusted, to see what others are blind to. The settlement was small enough that every life was seen, judged, and measured against its usefulness. In a world that demanded unyielding work, there was little room for sentiment. Anna learned this bitter truth each passing day. The first signs of her rejection were subtle. When her husband had been alive, she had been part of the rhythm of the community, attending church gatherings, sitting by the fire with neighbors, and sharing bread and laughter. After his death, and with her own condition weighing heavily on her, those same gatherings grew quieter when she entered. People spoke to her less. Invitations stopped. When she wheeled herself into the meeting house, she could feel the air shift, as though her presence carried a shadow no one wanted to acknowledge. Then came the avoidance. A neighbor who once leaned on her for sewing help now found excuses not to stop by. Children she had once watched and rocked to sleep were told to keep away. The women, burdened with their own endless chores, grew curt. The men, too, had little patience. A widow who could not contribute was of no use to anyone. And in this harsh land, being of no use was as good as being dead. The cruelty of it lay not in outright malice but in indifference. They did not spit at her door or curse her. Name, they did not shout at her to leave. They simply forgot her or pretended to. Needs were greater than compassion, and in their eyes Anna had been weighed and found lacking. Winter deepened the wound. Firewood was scarce, and when the first snow came, her stack was half the size of others. No one offered to bring more. The cold seeped into her bones, and there were nights she sat with blankets piled high, shivering, staring into the last flicker of her fire. Hunger, too, became her companion. Families rationed their grain, their meat, their beans. A woman who gave nothing in return was seldom remembered when food was divided. Some nights she ate nothing at all. The hardest part was how quickly the rejection spread. It was not just food and warmth she was denied, but belonging itself. At gatherings, conversation ceased when she came near. At church, her prayers felt heavier, not because she doubted God, but because she wondered why his people had turned their faces away. And when she rolled past others in her makeshift chair, she caught the whispers, "She'd never make it. She's cursed. Better if she had gone with her husband." The words stung not just for their cruelty, but for the casual way they were spoken. To them, her life had already been decided, written off as tragedy with no chapter left to tell. And yet, Anna endured. She bore their silence and their whispers with the same determination that she had carried since the day her body failed her. Each morning she pulled herself up, dragged her useless legs from bed, and set about what little tasks she could do. She patched her clothes with scraps of cloth. She mended what tools she could reach. She kept her cabin swept, her small hearth burning, and her dignity intact. But even her strength had limits. There were nights when the loneliness pressed down so hard it seemed to choke her. Nights when she cried quietly into her pillow, remembering her husband's laugh, the warmth of his hand, the way he had once told her she was the bravest woman he knew. Without him, the world felt colder, sharper, more merciless. And the rejection of the community, their dismissal of her as nothing more than dead weight, cut deeper than any physical pain she had ever endured. Rejection reshaped her life. It taught her how easily people could abandon someone once useful. It revealed the frailty of friendship when survival was at stake. And worst of all, it made her doubt herself. She wondered if perhaps they were right, if she truly was nothing but a mouth to feed, a shadow clinging to life out of stubbornness. But somewhere inside her, Beneath the ache and despair, there was a spark that refused to go out. She reminded herself each morning that she was still alive, that her heart still beat, that she still had a soul unbroken by their judgment. If no one else saw her worth, then perhaps it was because they did not know what strength truly was. They measured strength by swinging axes, by plowing fields, by shouldering rifles. But there was another kind of strength, the strength to endure rejection, to carry grief, to live each day without kindness, and still rise to face another dawn. Anna did not yet know it, but that was the strength the warrior would one day see. The very quality her own people dismissed as useless would be the one thing that set her apart. But for now, she lived in the shadow of rejection, walking, crawling through days heavy with silence, waiting for something, someone, to remind her that she had not been erased. It is one thing to feel ignored, and another to hear your name carried on the breath of others, twisted into pity and scorn. Anna came to know the sting of both. In a place where the community's survival depended on every strong back and willing hand, her presence became a subject of murmured conversations. Spoken just loud enough for her to catch. At first, the whispers were cloaked in sympathy. "Poor woman," they said. "What a shame." But sympathy soured quickly when the months dragged on and her condition showed no sign of improving. The whispers changed shape. They sharpened, became colder. "She's not long for this world. She'll never manage on her own. She's nothing but a mouth to feed." Anna tried to ignore them, but words have weight. They clung to her, pressing on her chest when she lay awake at night. She could hear them even when no one spoke, the echo of judgment ringing in her ears. The worst part was the way they spoke, as though she could not hear, as though her paralysis had deafened her, as though grief had made her blind. Sometimes, walking or dragging herself into a room, the silence that followed was louder than any words. Other times, she would pass by a group of women or men, and the conversations would continue as if she were invisible, but she could hear her name threaded into sentences like a thorn hidden among thistles. She'd never be chosen again. One woman whispered to another. She couldn't bear children even if someone wanted her, said a man by the well. Better she go east to a home for cripples than stay here. The whispers were cruel not just in their content but in their carelessness. They were spoken with a shrug, as though they were simply facts, the way one might discuss the weather or the thickness of the crops. In that casual cruelty, Anna felt the depth of her exile. Children, too, repeated what they heard. One boy, emboldened by the laughter of his friends, called her dead legs when she passed. A girl, curious and innocent, once asked her directly, "Why don't you just stop living if you can't walk?" The child's mother hushed her, embarrassed, but offered no apology. Anna simply smiled and said nothing. Though her hand shook long after in private, Anna wrestled with those whispers. Were they right? Was she nothing more than weakness embodied, a burden carried by those who no longer cared to carry her? Her own mind became another voice in the chorus, repeating the doubts until they sank into her bones. She prayed at night for strength, for a sign that she was more than what they said. But the heavens were silent, and the whispers grew louder. Still, she clung to small acts of defiance. She mended her clothes with needle and thread, even when her fingers cramped. She gathered herbs she could reach near her cabin and brewed medicines for herself. She found ways to make her body move, dragging herself from one chair to another, refusing to let her muscles waste away entirely. These were small victories, invisible to the settlement. To them, she was still weakness made flesh. But to Anna, these quiet battles were proof that she was not yet defeated. There were moments when she longed to shout at them all, to wheel herself into the center of the settlement and scream, "I am still here. I am more than these useless legs," but she never did. Silence had become her armor. If they wanted to believe her weak, let them. She would endure in silence, though every whisper cut her like a blade. Unseen by those who judged her, the whispers were forging something inside her. They were chiseling away her illusions about community, stripping her of dependence, and hardening her spirit. What remained was lean and unyielding. She would not have called it strength. She still thought herself weak, but one day another would see it clearly. For now she bore the whispers as she bore the cold and hunger, with clenched teeth and quiet resolve. She let them think she was fading. She let them pity her, mock her, erase her. But in her heart, beneath the pain and loneliness, she carried a truth even she did not fully understand, that surviving scorn is its own kind of power. The settlement saw only weakness. Soon a stranger would see otherwise. And when his eyes met hers, he would not hear the whispers. They would be drowned out by a voice stronger, truer, his own. The settlement had long lived with the fear of the Comanche. They were spoken of in hushed tones, horsemen swift as the wind, fierce in battle, relentless in defending their lands. Mothers used their name to hush restless children, and men sharpened their rifles with uneasy glances toward the horizon whenever rumors spread of riders spotted nearby. To the settlers, the Comanche were not men but shadows, reminders that this was not truly their land, but borrowed ground. It was in the spring, when the earth was softening after the long winter, that the warrior came. Anna heard of his presence before she saw him. Voices carried through the settlement tight, uneasy whispers about a lone Comanche who had been captured after a skirmish at the edge of their territory. He had been brought into camp under watchful eyes, his hands bound, his head held high, despite the ropes. Some men wanted him executed, fearing he was a scout for a larger war party. Others argued he should be traded, ransomed, or questioned for information. Whatever his fate, he had unsettled the town. Anna, from her small cabin, felt the shift in the air. Fear thickened conversations, and every passing wagon seemed filled with tension. She had heard such rumors before: raids, horse thefts, distant battles, but this time the danger was not out there on the plains. It was here, inside the fragile safety of the settlement. The first time she saw him was from a distance. Men had tied him to a post near the edge of the meeting grounds, a warning to his kind and a display of the settlement's power. Anna dragged herself to her window and peered through the warped glass. He stood tall, even bound, his dark hair hanging loose around his shoulders, his eyes sharp and unyielding. There was no fear in his face, no sign of defeat, only a kind of quiet defiance, as though ropes meant little to him. The settlers gathered in knots, watching him with suspicion and anger. Children peeked from behind skirts. Dogs barked. Men kept rifles close. Yet Anna, staring at him from her dim cabin, felt something shift inside her. This man, even in captivity, radiated strength. Not the brute kind she had seen so often among her own people, men boasting of their muscles or their rifles, but a deeper strength, woven into his bearing, carved into the way he stood against the world. Days passed. The settlement debated his fate endlessly, suspicion gnawing at them. Some feared killing him would invite vengeance. Others feared letting him love would do the same. Meanwhile, Anna found herself drawn to watch. When she could, she wheeled herself to the edge of the clearing, far enough to go unnoticed, near enough to study him. She noticed details others missed. How he watched everything, every movement, every gesture. How he carried himself as though he were free, though his hands were bound. How he never begged, never cursed, never lowered his head. The people called him savage. They whispered that he was less than human. But to Anna, he seemed more alive than any man she had known since her husband's death. The irony was bitter. She, dismissed as weak, useless, unwanted, felt more kinship with the bound warrior than with her own people. He was an outsider, judged by what they feared. She was an outcast, judged by what they pitied. Yet both bore their exile with the same quiet defiance. The first time their eyes met was brief, but it burned itself into her memory. She had rolled closer than usual that day, her chair creaking across the dirt. When he turned his head, his gaze landed on her with startling directness. His eyes, dark and unwavering, did not look at her legs, did not flicker with pity. He looked at her, only her, as though he saw through the whispers and the rejection to something truer. For a heartbeat, she forgot her useless body. For a heartbeat, she felt visible again. But the spell was broken when a man shouted at her to move along. "Don't linger, Anna. He's dangerous." She nodded and turned away, but her hands trembled as she gripped the wheels of her chair. Dangerous. That was the word they used for him. Weak was the word they used for her. But in that glance, Anna felt something neither dangerous nor weak, something unspoken, something she could not yet name. The warrior remained bound, but Anna sensed his presence even when she did not see him. He was a storm contained, a wild horse tethered. And in his defiance, she felt the stirrings of something she thought she had lost forever: recognition. What she did not yet know was that this man, this feared warrior, would soon be the one to speak the words that would shatter the whispers of weakness forever. The warrior remained bound near the edge of the settlement for days, a spectacle and a warning. Some settlers came to gawk, throwing insults or muttering threats as they passed. Others ignored him entirely, hoping he would vanish as quickly as he had appeared. But Anna could not keep her distance. Something about him unsettled her, not with fear, but with curiosity, like a spark catching in a pile of dry wood, threatening to burn if she let it grow. One afternoon, most of the men were away hunting and the settlement had fallen into a tense quiet. Anna found herself rolling her chair toward the post where he was kept. Her hand shook as she pushed the wheels forward, heart hammering in her chest. She told herself she only wanted a closer look, that there was no danger. And yet, every instinct screamed at her to turn back. But she did not turn out. The warrior noticed her before she spoke. His eyes, dark, steady, unreadable, shifted to her as she approached. He did not sneer or look away, as most of her own people did. He did not let his gaze drift to her useless legs. Instead, he held her eyes as though she were an equal, as though he were waiting for her to speak. Anna swallowed. "Do you understand me?" Her voice came out thin, almost trembling. For a long moment, he said nothing. She wondered if she had been foolish to try, if the language between them would prove too wide a gulf. But then, slowly, he nodded. His lips parted, and in halting English, he answered, "Some." The sound of his voice startled her. It was deep, roughened by disuse, but calm, neither pleading nor threatening. She had expected anger or arrogance, but there was none. She wet her lips. "They say you are dangerous." A flicker of something passed through his eyes, the shadow of a smile or perhaps disdain. To them, yes. His gaze did not waver. To you? No. Her chest tightened. No one had spoken to her so directly in years, not since her husband. Everyone else looked at her with pity, with whispers, with dismissal. But this man, this so-called savage, spoke as though she mattered. "You don't fear me?" she asked. His head tilted slightly. "Should I fear you?" The question struck her like a blow. For a moment, she could not speak. Should he fear her? The idea was absurd. She was the paralyzed widow, the cast-off, the one no man wanted. Yet, he asked it without jest, without mockery. He asked it as though it were a real question, as though her spirit were something worth reckoning with. "I am no one," she whispered. He shook his head. "You are still here," the words lodged in her heart. Simple yet truer than anything she had heard in years. She was still here. Against hunger, loneliness, rejection, she was still alive. And to this man, that seemed to mean something. Conversation was cut short by the approach of a settler. One of the guards barked at her. "Anna, leave him be. He's not for you to talk to." The man's eyes narrowed with suspicion, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm. Anna nodded quickly, feigning obedience, but as she wheeled herself away, she risked one last glance back. The warrior's gaze followed her, steady, unafraid. For the first time in years, she felt seen not as a cripple, not as a burden, but as a woman who had survived. That night, she lay awake long after the fire had died down, replaying every word, every look. She tried to convince herself it meant nothing, that he was only a prisoner, a stranger, a man who would soon be gone. But she could not shake the feeling that something had shifted. For so long she had been invisible, erased by whispers and neglect. Yet in a single moment, in a single exchange, the Comanche warrior had spoken to her as though she carried strength even she could not see. And in that quiet, unlikely encounter, the first threads of a bond were woven, one that neither the settlements, fear nor her own doubts could easily unravel. After that first stolen conversation, Anna tried to stay away. She told herself it was foolish to draw near him again. He was a prisoner, a danger in the eyes of the settlement, a man destined for a fate she could not change. Yet her heart betrayed her reason. Each day her thoughts returned to his steady gaze and the words he had spoken. "You are still here." The settler's suspicion of her lingered after that afternoon. She heard it in their muttered comments. When she rolled by, what business has she with him? She'd best not get ideas. Even the preacher's wife warned her, sotto voce, that speaking with such a man could taint her soul. But Anna had lived too long under the weight of whispers to let them govern her now. If she wanted to speak with him, she would doubt, so she returned. Not openly, not when the men gathered to argue his fate. She came at quieter hours when the guards were distracted, or when she could find a corner of privacy at the edge of the post where he was tied. At first their conversations were short, broken by the limits of his English. But words were not always needed. There was meaning in his silences, in the tilt of his head, in the way his eyes followed her movements with unwavering attention. It was during one of these visits that he began to test her. "You do not walk," he said one morning, studying her as she shifted herself awkwardly from her chair to a low bench near him. His voice was not cruel, not mocking, only blunt, as though he were naming a fact. "No," Anna replied, a bitter smile on her lips. "I do not. Others say you are weak." The words stung, though they were nothing new. She let out a hollow laugh. "They say worse than that." His eyes narrowed, searching her face. Then, in a voice quieter than before, he asked, "Are you weak?" The question hung in the air between them. It was not asked as an accusation, but as a challenge, one she could not dismiss with an easy answer. Her throat tightened. For so long, she had lived under the settlement's judgment that she had nearly accepted it herself. Yet here was a man, bound to a post, daring her to claim something different. "I survive," she said at last, her voice steadier than she felt. "Does that sound weak to you?" His lips curved, not quite a smile, but close. "No, that sounds strong." The simple affirmation left her breathless. No one had ever said such a thing to her. Not since her husband's death, not since the accident that stole her legs. Strong? The word sank deep into her bones, warming her like fire. From then on, their talks often circled back to strength. He would ask her questions that unsettled her, questions no one else dared to voice. What keeps you alive when all others turn away? Why do you not give up? What do you still hope for? Sometimes she bristled at his bluntness. Sometimes his words cut too close to her fears. But each time she found herself answering honestly, stripping away the mask she wore for the settlement. She told him of her grief, of the night she wished for death, of the small ember of will that kept her rising each day despite it all. And though he seldom offered comfort, she saw respect in his eyes, a respect more valuable than pity. In return, he told her pieces of his own life. His words came haltingly in English, but his meaning was clear. He spoke of the horse he had once raised from a foal, of battles fought on the open plains, of the long silence of winter nights under the stars. He spoke not to boast, but to remind her that strength came in many forms: endurance, loyalty, resilience. It was in these exchanges that Anna began to see herself differently. The settlement had reduced her to a burden, a ghost, a reminder of tragedy. But in the eyes of the warrior, she was something else. A woman who had endured more than most and still endured. His challenges forced her to look at her own suffering not as weakness, but as proof of a strength invisible to others. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and shadows stretched long across the clearing, he said, "Your body does not move, but your spirit does not break. That is stronger than legs." Anna felt tears sting her eyes, though she quickly blinked them away. For years she had prayed for someone, anyone, to see her as more than what she had lost. And now, bound to a post, a man her people called savage had done what her own kind never would. He had given her back her strength. She left that night with her heart racing, her mind alive with words she could not forget. The warrior had tested her, and she had answered. For the first time in years, she believed her answer might be true. The day of reckoning came not by Anna's choosing, but by the restless fear of the settlement. The Comanche warrior had been their prisoner long enough, and the people grew uneasy with his presence. Whispers filled the meeting house, voices sharp with anger and suspicion. Some demanded his death, fearing he was a scout for others waiting beyond the plains. Others urged caution, fearing retaliation if they killed him. Anna heard it all from her corner of the room. She was rarely welcome at such meetings, but she went anyway. Her presence made the settlers uneasy, her chair creaking across the floor as she dragged herself into the shadows near the back. Most ignored her. A few frowned, as if her very attendance was an intrusion. But she wanted to hear what they planned. For him, for the man who, bound though he was, had given her more dignity in a few words than her neighbors had in years. The warrior stood in the center, rope still binding his hands, but his head was held high. He faced their accusations without flinching, his dark eyes steady, his silence more commanding than their loudest threats. To Anna, he looked like a man already free, no matter the ropes. The settlement leader, a broad-shouldered man with a graying beard, struck the table with his fist. "He is a danger to us all. We cannot keep him here. He must be dealt with." Murmurs of agreement filled the room. Some shouted for his death, others for his exile. The clamor grew until the room was thick with fear and anger. Through it all, the warrior said nothing. He only watched them, his gaze sweeping across the faces twisted with suspicion. And then, without warning, his eyes found Anna. The room quieted as he spoke, his English halting but clear. "You fear me." His voice carried like thunder, though he did not raise it. "But you are wrong about strength." The settlers shifted uncomfortably, some scoffing, others scowling. But before they could silence him, he turned his gaze fully upon Anna. "You call her weak." His voice grew firmer, his words measured, each one striking the room like a blow. "But she is stronger than I will ever be." Silence fell. The settlers stared at him, then at Anna. Some looked confused, others disgusted. A few laughed nervously, dismissing his words as madness. Anna froze, her breath caught in her chest. The weight of his declaration pressed against her like a tidal wave. Stronger than him? stronger than a warrior who had ridden into battles, who had lived a life of danger and survival. The words seemed impossible, and yet the way he spoke them, with such conviction, left no room for doubt. He continued, his gaze never leaving hers. I fight with weapons. I fight with horses, but she fights every day with nothing. She has no legs, no husband, no people, yet she lives. That is strength greater than mine. A hush fell over the room, thick and uncomfortable. The settlers shifted in their seats, some avoiding Anna's eyes, others frowning as though insulted by the warrior's praise. They had dismissed her as a shadow, a burden, an empty shell of what she once was. And now, in front of them all, a man they feared had named her stronger than himself. Anna's throat ached, her eyes burning with tears she fought to hold back. For so long she had borne the whispers, the pity, the rejection. And now before the very people who had abandoned her, her worth had been spoken aloud. One of the men scoffed, spitting on the ground. You'd honor a cripple over yourself? Nonsense. The warrior's eyes narrowed. You see only bodies. I see spirit. The word struck harder than any blow. Some settlers muttered angrily, unwilling to accept such a truth. But others, just a few, looked at Anna differently, as though seeing her for the first time. Their faces held no pity, no disgust, only a quiet uncertainty. Anna sat in stunned silence, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no words. She wanted to speak, to thank him, to cry out in defiance against the years of dismissal, but her voice failed her. And yet, perhaps she did not need to speak. His words had been enough. When the meeting ended, decisions about the warrior's fate still unsettled, Anna wheeled herself back to her cabin in a daze. She felt the settlers' eyes on her as she went, heavy with confusion, anger, or newfound curiosity. But she no longer cared. The whispers that had haunted her for years were shattered, for in front of them all, the Comanche warrior had declared a truth she had long buried. She was not weak. She had never been weak. And in his voice and his belief, she felt herself rising. Again, not on her legs, but in her spirit, stronger than she had ever dared to believe. The settlement was never a place of swift change. Its people clung to old habits and harsher judgments. For in a land so unforgiving, caution and suspicion often meant survival. But after the warrior's words, a subtle shift began to ripple through the camp. It did not happen all at once there. Were no sudden apologies, no open arms to welcome Anna back into the fold. Change came slowly, hesitantly, like the first shoots of grass pushing through winter's hard soil. For days after the meeting, Anna felt the weight of eyes upon her. Wherever she wheeled herself, the well, the chapel, even the narrow path between. Cabin's people watched, not with the same pitying glances as before, nor with the cruel dismissal she had grown used to. Their looks carried something different now, curiosity, wariness. A hint of unease doubt the warrior's declaration had unsettled them deeply. To be called weak by their own neighbors was nothing new. They knew well how to dismiss those who faltered. But to be told, by a man they feared, that a woman they had rejected possessed more strength than he did, that struck at the very foundation of their judgments. Some laughed it off. She overheard one man chuckling near the forge, saying, "The savage's head's been cooked by the sun? Stronger than him?" Fool talk. But even as he laughed, his hammer fell harder on the anvil, his blows more forceful than before, as though trying to drive out doubt. Others muttered more quietly, uneasily. A woman at the well stole long glances at Anna before finally speaking. "Is it true? Do you talk to him?" she asked, her voice low, as if fearing the question itself. Anna, surprised, simply nodded. The woman pursed her lips, then said nothing more. For the first time in years, people began to speak to her again, not often, not kindly, but they no longer ignored her entirely. A boy ran past her cabin one morning and waved instead of staring. An old man, usually gruff, paused long enough to nod when she passed. Small gestures, but gestures nonetheless. Still, there were those who clung stubbornly to their disdain. He only said it to mock us, one neighbor sneered. He praises her because he wants us divided. Another spat in the dirt as Anna wheeled by, muttering, "Stronger? She can't even walk." Their bitterness stung, but for once, their words did not crush her. The warrior's declaration had given her a shield against such venom. She carried his belief within her, and it steadied her heart against their scorn. Inside herself, too, a shift had begun. She found she moved differently through her days, not faster, not stronger, but with a quiet dignity she had not felt in years. Tasks that once felt like burdens now became acts of defiance. When she patched her clothes, she thought, "This is proof I endure." When she hauled water with shaking arms, she told herself, "This is strength they cannot see." The whispers had once defined her. Now the warrior's words echoed louder, reshaping the way she saw herself. The children, in their innocence, were the quickest to change. They began to approach her cabin again, drawn by curiosity. One little girl, bold with the unfiltered honesty of youth, asked, "Did he really say you're stronger than him?" Anna smiled faintly and answered, "He did." The girl studied her seriously, then nodded, as though that simple truth was enough. Children carried fewer prejudices than their parents, and Anna wondered if perhaps the next generation would not see her as a burden, but as something else entirely. At night, alone in her cabin, Anna reflected on the strange turn of events. She had lived for years in shadows, invisible to those around her, convinced her life had no meaning beyond survival. Now, because of a single man's words, the shadows were thinning. She was still isolated, still bound by her body, still mistrusted by many, but the silence around her had been broken. The warrior had forced the settlement to look at her, truly look, for the first time in years. Whether they liked it or not, his declaration had planted a seed of doubt in their judgments. They could no longer dismiss her so easily, not when a man they feared and respected for his resilience had claimed her strength surpassed his own. And Anna, though cautious, felt the stirring of something long dormant. Hope. Not hope that her legs would return, nor that she would be embraced entirely by the community, but hope that her life still had worth, that she was more than the whispers, more than the pity, more than the rejection. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to imagine a different future, one not defined by loss or scorn, but by resilience, by the truth spoken aloud before all. She did not yet know what that future might hold, whether the warrior would remain, whether the settlement would soften, whether she would ever find belonging again. But she knew this. She was no longer invisible. The warrior had declared her strong, and in the echo of his voice, the world around her had begun to shift. The days that followed were uneasy ones for the settlement. The warrior remained a prisoner, but the ropes seemed less binding than before. His words had unsettled the people, and though they still argued about his fate, a strange hesitation crept into their judgment. Some feared killing him would dishonor them. Others feared letting him love would weaken their authority. In the end, they did nothing, and so he remained watched, mistrusted, yet alive. For Anna, that indecision was a gift. It gave her time to return to him when she could, time to speak words that no one else would hear, time to build something that felt, against all odds, like belonging. Their conversations grew bolder. No longer limited to a handful of cautious words, they began to share pieces of themselves. Anna told him about her husband, how he had been kind, how he had died too young, how his absence had left her adrift. She told him about the accident that stole her legs, about the whispers that followed, about the long years of silence and loneliness. To her surprise, he did not look at her with pity. He listened, his dark eyes steady, as though her story was worth hearing. In turn, he told her his name. Tahu. It meant strong oak, he explained haltingly, though in his tongue the word carried more weight than English could hold. He spoke of his people, of nights under open skies, of the freedom of the plains. He spoke of battles fought, of scars carried with pride, of the bond between a warrior and his horse. Each word painted a picture of a life she could scarcely imagine, a life wild and untamed compared to the rigid, narrow existence of the settlement. The more they spoke, the more Anna felt something stirring in her, something beyond gratitude, beyond curiosity. With him, she did not feel invisible. With him, she was not the paralyzed widow. She was simply Anna, a woman with a mind, a voice, a heart that still beat. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in strokes of gold and crimson, she asked him quietly, "Why did you say those words? Why tell them I am stronger than you?" He looked at her for a long time before answering. "Because it is true." She shook her head, her throat tightening. "I have nothing. I cannot walk. I cannot work. They are right. I am a burden." Tahu leaned closer, his bound hands resting loosely in his lap. "You live," he said simply, "when all say you should not. You rise each day when others would not. That is strength greater than any weapon." His words washed over her like a balm. For years she had measured herself against what she could no longer do. But Tahu measured her by what she endured, and by that measure she was not weak but unyielding. As the days passed, Anna found herself changing in small ways. She carried herself differently, not with her legs, but with her spirit. She no longer avoided the eyes of others. When whispers rose, she let them pass like wind through trees, no longer letting them define her. She tended her cabin with renewed vigor, not as a burdened soul scraping by, but as a woman who still had worth. And in quiet moments with Tahu she found laughter again, real, unguarded laughter. He had a dry wit, and though his English was rough, his humor carried through. Once, when she stumbled over her chair's wheel and cursed under her breath, he chuckled and said, "Your spirit runs faster than your legs ever could." She laughed until tears ran down her cheeks, and in that moment she realized how long it had been since joy had touched her. But with joy came fear. She knew what others would say if they saw the bond forming between them. To the settlement, he was the enemy. To her, he was becoming something far more dangerous. Hoped out at night, she wrestled with that fear, her heart warring with her reason. Yet each time she returned to him, each time their eyes met and their words bridged the gulf between their worlds, the fear lessened. Something stronger took root in its place, a bond neither ropes nor prejudice could sever. Anna did not yet know what future awaited them. She did not know if Tahu would be freed or killed or taken away. She did not know if the settlement would ever accept her, let alone the bond she now shared with him. But for the first time in years, she did not dwell on endings. She lived. In the moments they had, the quiet talks, the shared silences, the recognition in his eyes. In those moments, she found a new life, not one measured by legs that did not move, nor by a community that dismissed her, but by the strength of connection, by the truth of being seen, and by the growing bond with a warrior who had given her back her worth. The prairie was a land of long shadows. Dawn stretched them thin across the grass, and twilight pulled them wide across the earth. Anna had lived for years as a shadow herself, present, but unseen, alive yet forgotten. But by the time summers, heat gave way to the first cool winds of autumn, she no longer felt hidden. The settlement's decision about Tahu had dragged on. Some wanted him executed. Others feared retaliation if they did. In the end, they chose exile. One morning he was led beyond the settlement's edge, his bonds cut, his horse returned to him. The people thought they had rid themselves of him, yet his words remained behind like a fire's smoke clinging to cloth. They could not erase what he had said. Anna did not beg him to stay. She knew his world was not hers, and she would not chain him as others had tried. Still, when he mounted his horse, his gaze found hers across the open space. In that silent moment, Anna felt no loss. She felt a promise. Whether or not he ever returned, he had given her something no one else could: the knowledge that her life, even in its brokenness, held unshakable strength. In the days that followed, she noticed how much had changed within her. The whispers that once pierced her now glanced off like arrows against a shield. Where others had turned their faces away, she now held her head high. She began to take part, again in small pieces of the settlement's life, not because she craved their acceptance, but because she no longer needed it. One afternoon, she rolled her chair into the chapel, where the preacher paused mid-sermon, startled by her presence. The congregation shifted uneasily, but Anna did not leave. She sat in the back, her hands folded, and listened. When she bowed, her head in prayer, she did not ask for her legs back, nor for the settlement to love her. She simply whispered, "Thank you. Thank you for making me strong." The children came first, as they often did. They lingered at her door, curious, unafraid. She began to tell them stories not of her suffering, but of endurance, of courage, of finding light in dark places. They listened with wide eyes, perhaps sensing that what she spoke was not weakness but survival. Their parents still watched warily, but the children's laughter around her cabin softened the sharp edges of the settlement's silence. The warriors. Absence was felt like a missing heartbeat, yet Anna did not despair. Instead, she carried his words as one might carry a flame, carefully, protectively, with reverence. She replayed them often in her mind. "You fight every day with nothing. That is strength greater than mine." Those words did not fade. They grew. They became her armor, her foundation, her truth. As weeks turned into months, Anna noticed something remarkable. Where once neighbors hurried past her, a few now lingered. A woman left a loaf of bread on her step without a word. A man paused to ask if she needed wood for the fire. Their actions were hesitant, awkward, but they were actions nonetheless. She realized that even if they could not say it aloud, the warrior's declaration had unsettled them into change. Slowly, reluctantly, they were beginning to see her as something more than a burden. And Anna herself began to see differently, too. She no longer measured her worth by what she lacked. Her legs had failed her, her husband was gone, her neighbors had abandoned her, but still she endured. She faced every day without guarantee of kindness, without promise of love, yet she lived on. That, she finally understood, was not weakness. It was strength. On a cool autumn evening, as she sat outside her cabin watching the horizon bleed red with the setting sun, she thought of Tahu. Perhaps he was out there, riding beneath the vast sky, free as the wind. Perhaps he had forgotten her. Or perhaps, somewhere in his journeys, he carried her in his heart as she carried him in hers. Whatever the truth, it no longer mattered. What mattered was the gift he had left her, the ability to see herself as more than her broken body, more than her widowhood, more than the judgment of others. He had reminded her of what she had always been, but had forgotten: resilient, enduring, strong. Anna closed her eyes and let the wind brush against her face. For the first time in years, she did not feel like a shadow. She felt like herself, whole, unbroken, alive. Strength, she realized, was not in the legs that carried a body, nor in the hands that wielded weapons. True strength was in the spirit that refused to bow. Even when the world turned its back, and with that truth burning steady within her, Anna was no longer the paralyzed widow rejected by all. She was Anna, the woman who had been seen, who had endured, who was stronger than even a warrior.